Welcome to today's event. I'm Caroline Fredrickson. I'm the Executive Director of the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy, otherwise known as ACS. For those of you unfamiliar with ACS, we are a national network of lawyers, law students, policymakers, and judges dedicated to promoting the vitality of the U.S. Constitution and the fundamental values it expresses: individual rights and liberties, genuine equality, access to justice, democracy, and the rule of law. Today's discussion promises to be a very good one. The don't ask, don't tell policy and its effects are being debated anew. The House of Representatives is considering the Military Readiness Enhancement Act, and Senate Armed Services Chairman Carl Levin has made a commitment to hold a hearing this fall. Some argue that the timing is not right for this discussion, with the nation actively engaged in conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Others contend that now is precisely the time when such a discussion cannot and should not be avoided. Much press attention has been paid to General Stanley McChrystal's assessment on Afghanistan and on his call for more troops. Given this projected need, a policy that has resulted in the dismissals of more than 13,000 troops certainly warrants reevaluation and discussion. Fortunately, we have a great slate of experts to conduct just such a discussion, and I will let the moderator introduce these panelists, but I have the pleasure first of introducing the moderator, Lawrence Korb. Fully enumerating Larry's credentials would take hours. So I'm going to be brief, confident in the knowledge that you have a fuller description in the speaker biography handouts. Larry is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a senior advisor at the Center for Defense Information. Prior to this, he was a senior fellow and director of National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. In addition to stints at the Brookings Institution and the American Enterprise Institute, Larry served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense from 1981 to 1985, where he was awarded the Department of Defense's Medal for Distinguished Public Service. Larry?
Thank you very much, and let me join in welcoming you all to this panel. And I'd like to begin to direct your attention to the title of it, because I think this is very important. We're talking about the impact on military readiness. There's other issues that we could talk about, but we did want to focus on that. And we've got a terrific panel to be able to do that. What I will do is I'm going to introduce each of the moderators in turn, and then I'm going to play a dual role, because we had originally Charles Cully Simpson, who's a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Detainee Affairs, who's been involved in these issues for most of his career. He had a death in the family, so he could not make it. So I'm going to try, after I have the other panelists speak, and present some of the arguments that I think he might have based upon what I've read about his writings and everything. So at least you get it, I think, so we can get the discussion going to make sure that people hear all sides of the issue. Our first panelist is Dr. Nathaniel Frank, who's currently a senior research fellow at the Center of the Palm Center and an adjunct professor at NYU. He's written all kinds of op-eds and magazine articles, and probably is the leading expert on the history of this debate. So I'm going to ask Dr. Frank to begin by sort of putting the current debate in context.
Thank you, Larry. It's a particular pleasure to be here with Larry again, who's been such a consistent force of reasoned dialogue for this issue, as well as my co-panelists and friends, Aubrey and Eric. And thank you all for coming. I want to spend my 7.5 minutes trying to summarize a little bit of the question of how we ended up with a ban on openly gay troops, why we have this ban, kind of how we got to where we are. If anyone can't hear me, just raise your hand and I'll try to do better. The military's ban has always been a policy in search of a rationale. That is, the ban came first, and the reason for it was more of an afterthought. A rationale sort of becomes a rationalization when it's more of a way to justify a feeling than a sound explanation for a public policy. It has sometimes been pointed out that the military's policy against homosexual conduct is long-standing, and in fact that language appears in the statute itself. And some people take that to mean that there's always been a ban on gay people. Not so. And that's because there haven't always been gay people. Now that may sound a little bit funny to some of you. The reason I say that is this: homosexuality as an identity, as a conception of a distinct person different from other people, is a relatively modern concept. It's a 20th century concept. And in fact, there was a brief written by eminent historians that shaped the Supreme Court's opinion in the 2003 Lawrence v. Texas case to this effect, refuting the idea that laws against homosexual sodomy were deeply rooted in our nation's past. Now, laws against sodomy are indeed long-standing, both in the military and until 2003 in many states in the Union. But these were laws which I would submit were inherited without much thought or discussion from English common law and then via the colonies to the original states, that punished all kinds of conduct that lay outside traditional norms of matrimonial, mission-style sexual conduct. And this is important. It's what historians call cultural or historical lag, that there's a group of laws and policies and customs that we still adhere to in many ways, but that emerged in a context that no longer describes the world we live in. So these were laws against any kind of conduct that were not geared toward reproduction. They punished sodomy, which includes oral sex, adultery, fornication, masturbation, contraception, even sex in the wrong position. Anything, in short, that was thought to undermine aims that most of us now don't want to uphold. Increasing tribal populations, protecting racial purity, arranging marriages to consolidate family power. So as a result of these prohibitions that are still in some capacity on the books, thousands of current uniformed personnel routinely engage in conduct that remains a felony under military law, namely oral sex, even among married people in the military. So our current policies were created to serve a world, I'd suggest, that no longer exists. A time when there was no understanding of homosexual persons as we currently understand it. Instead, all people were understood to have the capacity to engage in mischievous behavior. And homosexual conduct was all the more likely, some thought, perhaps in the back of their minds, in a military setting, which is what sociologists call a homosocial institution, which often throws men together for extended periods of time without women. So it was this old idea that there's no such thing as a homosexual. We're all heterosexuals, but some of us have a homosexual problem, and we have a weakness for same-sex conduct. And that's the context of the prescriptions against homosexual conduct in the military. Now, if you still believe this, if you still believe that homosexual conduct is a behavior that anyone is prone to doing, rather than the behavior of a type of person, that it's a lapse in judgment that any person is susceptible to if sufficiently tempted, that is, if you think homosexuality is still a choice, you may be more inclined to continue to worry that allowing homosexuality in the military is a threat, that it could weaken the resolve of fragile sons and daughters and lure them into the homosexual lifestyle. Plenty of people, respectable people, still do believe this, and I think this is where a lot of the opposition to lifting the ban comes from. From my perspective, if you still believe this, you probably haven't spent enough time with real gay and lesbian people. If you recognize that homosexuality is not a choice, then discriminating against gays and lesbians becomes little different from discriminating against African Americans, Jews, Latinos, or any other minority group. Now, Don't Ask, Don't Tell is a different animal from the UCMJ's sodomy ban. It is administrative and not criminal. So these are important differences, but I'm trying to give you some of the historical context out of which both of these policies emerged. And I would submit that the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy has the same sort of ignoble past, that it was a policy that emerged in the late 20th century when strong emotions that weren't really backed up by reason were seeking a kind of rationalization. Now, I want to just end especially because Cully Stimson isn't here, and I want to help Larry argue some of the other side, with one more argument in favor of, or just to explain so I can try to dismantle, the main rationale of Don't Ask, Don't Tell itself, which is what emerged in the Clinton era, when Don't Ask, Don't Tell as a policy and subsequently a law that is informally called also Don't Ask, Don't Tell, emerged. And that is this. Some people say, I have nothing against homosexuals, and I don't honestly believe it's a choice. That's not the problem. The problem is that other people, particularly in the military, that draw from disproportionately conservative young populations, they have a problem with it. Their moral and social code is such that knowing that homosexuals were serving with them would undercut their morale, invade their privacy, make them uncomfortable, and that because straight people have a problem living with gay people, that's the reason we have to leave gay people out. It might not seem fair, but they're a small population, and we can't, because of their interests, risk undercutting the military. All of the research that has been done since Don't Ask, Don't Tell emerged, as well as material that was available before that, shows that that's not the case, shows that openly gay service works. And I have one of the handouts out there as a summary of studies done by the military, by academics, heavily sourced, of amassing all of this research, showing that those fears are, while perhaps understandable, misplaced. And one of the things that I do in the book that I just wrote, Unfriendly Fire, is talk to retired military personnel so that you don't have to take my word for this. People who were at the table, part of the military working group that wrote the blueprint that became Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And they tell me this too. They say in the book, this was not based on empirical research. It was based on our fears and our prejudice. It was something that we did by the seat of our pants. It was based on morality, about religious prescriptions against homosexuality. We didn't even look at the empirical evidence. And so that's kind of more evidence to my suggestion that while many fair-minded people may have genuine concerns about what would happen if we lifted the ban, that even those fears, now there are good fears and bad fears. There are rational fears and there's paranoia. So I'm suggesting and using my discussions at length with military officers themselves who were at the table formulating this policy, that this is a policy whose time has come. But I do think it's important to understand the full history of how we got here in order to have the most reasoned discussion about where we go from here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Aubrey Sarvis, who's currently the Executive Director of the Servicemen's Legal Defense Network. He brings a tremendous background to this post. He's had experience in business. He's been in the Army. He served as a chief counsel for the Senate Commerce Committee. And he will talk about what's happening on the legislative and executive front and the role that SLDN is playing in this debate. So, Aubrey.
Thank you very much, Larry. I'll try to give a brief snapshot of where we are today with the following key stakeholders. Capitol Hill, we'll talk about the House and the Senate, talk briefly about the White House, and then talk about the Pentagon. I think everyone knows in the House of Representatives we have H.R. 1283. That's the Military Readiness Enhancement Act. It was introduced March 3rd, 2009, and today it has a record number of co-sponsors, 175. I believe that much of the energy today around the House bill comes from the new leadership of Congressman Patrick Murphy and the active engagement of many of you here today in the audience and supporters of repeal around the country. House hearings are expected later this year or early next year in the House Armed Services Committee. It's not clear if that hearing will be in the full committee or in the Military Personnel Subcommittee chaired by Congresswoman Susan Davis. Over to the Senate, very briefly. There is no Senate companion bill to H.R. 1283. With the passing of Senator Kennedy, many of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal advocates have begun looking for a new lead sponsor. As many of you know, Senator Kennedy wanted to be the lead in the Senate, and he felt very strongly that the Senate bill should be bipartisan. SLDN also shares that view. We think it should be a bipartisan introduction, and we, along with many others, are still working for that. But a number of Democrats are ready for bill introduction, and I suspect we may soon have a Senate bill introduced. Yes, I know many of you have heard those predictions before, but the reality is I believe we will see that in the next 2 to 3 weeks. A don't ask, don't tell repeal hearing may occur in October or November in the full Senate Armed Services Committee. This would be the first time in over 15 years that a hearing on don't ask, don't tell has been held in the Senate. The Senate staff is still looking at the formulation of that hearing. Their first priority is to conclude the conference report on FY10 defense budget. They expect that conference to be concluded in the next week or two. Then I believe the staff will turn to the don't ask, don't tell hearing, looking at how that might come together. Perhaps there would be a panel of service members who are today adversely impacted by don't ask, don't tell. Perhaps service members who are on the brink of discharge. It may also be that the Senate will look at and have a focus solely on implementation. It's still not clear what direction the chairman wants to go in. Let's look at the White House. A number of us have had conversations with the White House on repealing don't ask, don't tell. The president has said repeatedly he supports repeal. He said it on the campaign trail, and he said it again in late June at the White House. He told us then he wanted to see Congress act with a sense of urgency. At that same White House reception, President Obama also told Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Victor Fehrenbach, a gay service member facing discharge under don't ask, don't tell, that, quote, we are going to get this done, end quote. The question today is just when and what role will the White House and the President play in this debate and in mustering the votes in the House and the Senate for full repeal? Yes, we know the White House, Congress, and all of Washington have been embroiled in the heated debate over health care and Afghanistan. The air has been sucked out of the room, and it is very hard to muster attention for many other issues, including repeal of don't ask, don't tell. But that does not mean that anyone should get a free ride on repeal. We haven't seen the White House's timeline, but we need to see their timeline and see it soon. Let's look at the Pentagon, or as I sometimes characterize it, looking for Secretary Gates and Chairman Admiral Mullen. Where do they really stand on repeal? What are they going to say about it, and when are they going to say it? Consider the following. On July 7, 2009, SLDN sent Secretary Gates a letter outlining 6 specific steps that he, as Secretary of Defense, could take immediately to enable gay and lesbian service members to continue to serve while Congress acts to repeal the Don't Ask, Don't Tell law. Unfortunately, SLDN has not received a response to that July letter. We will follow up with the Secretary this week. Consider this. In mid-August, Chairman Mullen put a video podcast on the Pentagon channel in which he was asked a question about what the Pentagon was doing in anticipation of the pledge that President Obama had made to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. In his response, Chairman Mullen said that there was, quote, a definite anticipation, end quote, and that President Obama had made his strategic intent very clear. Chairman Mullen went on to say that he had had several conversations with the service chiefs and combat commanders on the subject and that there was, quote, a lot of focus, end quote, on President Obama's intent, quote, before the law changes, end quote. Chairman Mullen also said, quote, when the law changes, end quote, that the Pentagon would carry out the repeal. But also consider this. On September 15th, just 14 days ago, Chairman Mullen appeared before the Senate Armed Services Committee for his confirmation hearing as chair of the JCS for another term. Chairman Mullen seemed to backtrack a bit on what he had said a month prior, and there was no endorsement of repeal at that hearing or in his written answers to the committee on Don't Ask, Don't Tell questions. In fact, the chairman didn't appear to be aligned with President Obama on repeal, his commander-in-chief. In written answers, Admiral Mullen called for, quote, a measured, deliberative approach to any change in the law, end quote, and asked for time to study how lengthy a, quote, phase-in period, end quote, there would be needed to implement repeal. To summarize where I think we may be with the key stakeholders, the House is fully engaged, mustering up the needed co-sponsors to pass repeal. Another round of hearings are anticipated. The Senate may be on the brink of a bill introduction and its first Don't Ask, Don't Tell hearing in almost 16 years. The White House appears to be working behind the scenes to encourage Senate introduction and hearings. And it is not at all clear where Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen stand on repeal, and what direct and candid conversations they may have had with senior White House officials about repeal, if any. If the Senate hearing happens in October or November, we may finally know where the Pentagon stands or does not stand on repeal. But at the end of the day, the decider here is not the Pentagon. Yes, the White House and Congress want to know where they stand and await their recommendation. But ultimately, this is a joint decision for Congress and the President, and both need to act on repeal in this Congress with a sense of urgency. Thank you.
Thank you, Aubrey. Our next speaker who will put a human face on this is a genuine American hero. This young man down at the the end of the podium here joined the Marines when he was 19 years old, served in Somalia, was among the first American soldiers to enter Iraq from Kuwait, and was the first American wounded in that war. He served in the Marines for 13 years, then got out to go back and finish college. He now has a master's degree, and it was after he came out of the Marines that he came out. So, Eric, welcome, and thank you very much for your service to the country.
Thank you, Larry. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Eric Fidelis Alva. I was a staff sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. I want to thank the American Constitution Society for holding this panel discussion on the military's Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, and for giving me the opportunity to share my experiences, the perspective of a gay military service member before Don't Ask, Don't Tell and during Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I grew up in a military family in Texas. My father served in Vietnam, surviving the Tet Offense. My grandfather served in World War II in Korea. I joined the military a year after high school. I tried college at first, but that was not working because my real dream was to be in the Marines. I joined the Marines because I wanted a challenge. I was only 5'1" and 102 pounds and 19 years old at the time in 1990. I was patriotic, idealistic, and I was also gay. For 13 years, I served in the Marine Corps. My first deployment came, as you heard Larry say, in 1992 when I was sent to Somalia for Operation Restore Hope, which most people remember from the movie Black Hawk Down. I lived in the stadium. Over the years, I kept re-enlisting even after the law Don't Ask, Don't Tell was created in 1993. In January of 2003, after another reenlistment, I was deployed to the Middle East. A couple of months later, in March of 2003, my military service would come to an end on the very first day ground troops entered the country of Iraq for the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom. I was part of 1st Marine Division, and I was on a logistical convoy headed towards the city of Basra. Our mission was to secure the city. We stopped outside the city at a province called Azubayr. It was there that the unit regrouped, rested, and waited for word when we were to enter the city of Basra. I had not eaten for quite some time, so I thought I'd best eat my MRE, meal ready to eat, before we got moving again. I decided to warm up the meal on the hood of my Humvee because on the passenger side it was just too crowded. As the meal was warming up, I decided to go back to the passenger side of my Humvee to retrieve something. 6.5 years later, till this day, I still can't remember what it was because I never made it. As I crossed that dusty patch of desert for the 3rd time that day, I triggered a landmine. I was thrown from the blast, landing feet away from the vehicle. The pain was unimaginable. My fellow Marines were rushing to my aid, cutting away my uniform to assess the damage and treat my wounds. I remember wondering why they weren't removing my right boot, as I screamed and asking the chaplain as he held my head in his hands, telling me, "It'll be okay." Another landmine detonated as I laid on the ground. It wasn't until later that I had learned it was my friend and fellow Texan Brian Alanis, then a medical corpsman in the Navy, as he tried to help me. When I awoke groggily in a hospital tent outside of Kuwait, my right leg was gone, my left leg broken, and my right arm broken, as well with permanent nerve damage. I had only been in Iraq for about 3 hours that day. I became the first American service member wounded in the Iraq War. I received the Purple Heart, along with visits from President Bush and the First Lady. He told me I was a hero. That landmine may have put an end to my military career that day, but it didn't put an end to my secret. That would come years later when I realized that I had fought and nearly died to secure the rights for others that I myself was not free to enjoy. More importantly, my experience disproved all the arguments against open service by gays and lesbians. I knew I had to share my story. Even under the military's don't ask, don't tell policy, I was out to a lot of my fellow Marines. The typical reaction from my straight, often married friends was, "So what?" I was the same person. I did my job well, and that's all they cared about. Today, I'm godfather to 3 of those men's children. Normally, I was cautious about whom I divulged my secret to. I felt I had to be. But for example, one evening, though, in 1996, out with some guys from our unit, I let my guard down. One of the guys commented on some women in the bar. When my response was less than enthusiastic, he asked me jokingly if I was gay. As a matter of fact, I am, I responded. He swore to keep my secret, but I suppose he thought it was just too good a piece of gossip to pass up. He was wrong. No one he told cared. The response from everyone was the same as it had been from friends in who I confided. So what? I was still Eric, still one of them, still a Marine. I was still trusted. That was a very powerful thing for me, that I still had their trust, because the supporters of Don't Ask, Don't Tell are right about one thing. Unit cohesion is essential. What my experience proves is that they're wrong about how to achieve it. My being gay, and even many of my colleagues knowing about it, didn't damage unit cohesion. They still put their lives in my hands, and when I was injured, they risked those lives to save mine. My experience gives me confidence in our military men and women. I'm confident that just as they are capable of immense professionalism and dedication to duty, putting their lives on the line every day, our soldiers are equally capable of putting aside personal bias and standing shoulder to shoulder with gay, lesbian, bisexual service members. They are there to fulfill the mission, just as my unit and I were doing that day in Iraq. As a former Marine and patriotic American, I am deeply disturbed that Don't Ask, Don't Tell is discouraging young patriots from joining the military at a time when our country needs their service. I am horrified that Don't Ask, Don't Tell forces trained and ready troops to choose between serving their country and living openly, a choice I myself would have been faced with had a landmine not made it for me. I am appalled at the involuntary separation of thousands of skilled service members during a time of 2 wars, threatening our country's military readiness for no good reason. I am also thankful for the acceptance of my unit members whose support protected me from a similar fate. My experiences serving in the military demonstrate that Don't Ask, Don't Tell is a solution looking for a problem. Since leaving the military, the opportunities I've had to speak with Americans, both gay and straight, have shown time and again that the American people support openly service by gay, lesbian, bisexual troops. Looking back on my years in the military, I am proud. I'm proud not only of my service and my sacrifice, but of the way my unit members accepted me. I'm proud not only of how American culture is becoming more accepting, but how the American military is evolving too. Now is the time to revisit this ill-considered policy. It is costing us far too much and purchasing us nothing in return. Those who support Don't Ask, Don't Tell claim they do so in the interest of unit cohesion. Well, as a former Marine, I can tell you what it takes to build unit cohesion. Trust. It takes trust in your fellow unit members to have your back and do their job. And I can also tell you that Don't Ask, Don't Tell does nothing but undercut that trust, and with it, our nation's security. Don't Ask, Don't Tell imposes secrecy and undermines unit cohesion, ousting gays and lesbians at the expense of the military readiness of the United States. Allowing gay, lesbian, and bisexual service members to serve openly will only improve unit cohesion and, in turn, our military. I stand here today on two good legs again, thankfully. A gay former Marine who survived a war, who survived a battle only to come home to another battle, the battle for equal rights and justice. The blood I shed in Iraq was for every individual's freedom in this country, not the selected few. That means everyone. Even those young, patriotic men and women who are gay and want to serve their country. I leave you with one last thing, my fellow Americans. Life is a gift. I know that firsthand. Everyone in this country is entitled to happiness. So don't let anyone ever own your happiness. Thank you, ACS, again, and everyone for being here on this important issue that I promise will not go away. I will continue to serve my country in a different capacity now. Thank you.
Now, I have the unenviable task of raising some of the other issues, but I will do my best. Let me begin by saying the following. A lot of people who want to keep the policy as it is basically will argue that the military does already discriminate against various groups. You have to, despite what you said, Eric, you have to have a certain height and weight. You've got to graduate from high school in many cases. You can't have a DUI or anything like this. So why can they not do this if they feel that this could undermine military readiness?
Well, so for instance, is this on? You have to graduate from high school in many cases, except for those cases where you don't, because they've decided that they'll give a waiver because there's not enough people to fill slots. Now, in the poor economy, the recruitment task has eased slightly, but it won't always be that way. And, of course, the devil is in the details. So we've kicked out over 300 linguists, including over 60 Arabic linguists. I mean, sure, there are standards. All of these decisions are a cost-benefit analysis. The question is, why do we have any particular standard that we have? Why do we grant moral waivers to felons, but not gay people who haven't actually done anything wrong? Whereas felons who have been waived into the military despite standards that would otherwise not allow them, research shows that they actually do raise the risk to military cohesion. So no one's arguing, and I know you're not, and perhaps Cully Simpson wouldn't either, who knows. No one's arguing. There's a stereotype when it comes to gay rights that when gays are insisting on their equal rights, that they just want it all. They want to be able to do whatever they want, not just do the same things that their straight counterparts are doing. And I think some of that comes into this debate as though what the argument is to lift the ban is that we should throw out all standards. The question is, can we have a rational discussion about which standards are applicable to unit cohesion?
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay. All right. Let me again raise the other question, which was raised by our executive director here. What about the fact, okay, any social change is going to be disruptive? We go back and you look whether it was the integration of African Americans, opening up opportunities for women. We are in the midst of two wars, so why don't we wait till we kind of can get things back to normal before we make the change? Eric, do you want to start with that?
That's a good discussion because everyone always feels that in a time of two wars that any social change and graduating with a master's in social work for social justice, it's either something that we're going to address now or later, but it's something that's not inevitably going to go away. Social change, as we saw in 1948 when President Truman had integrated, black and white troops, is something people had often argued the same situation, of course, during World War II and other wars that were soon upon us, like the Korean War. And so whether it was the right time then at the same time as it is now, most people even argued the same argument about women in combat in the early 90s and especially during the first Iraq War. It's something that is inevitably not going to be put away at a time, whether it's even if we were in 3 wars, who knows? The bottom line is it's arguably the fact that it's American people's fear and prejudice of social change as it was back in 1948. It's something that's going to have to be dealt with sooner or later, and it's something that's not going to go away, as I said. And it's ridiculous to think the fact that because now what you're doing is undermining the leadership and the professionalism of young patriotic men and women who, of course, it's hard to assimilate or relate unless you actually have been in the military what it's like to follow orders. And the new law would be the orders of the commander-in-chief and the members of Congress. And people would follow that, whether we're in war, like I said, or now later when hopefully we're not in 2 wars, but it's something that's going to have to be dealt with. And I believe the men and women are capable and more intelligent and leadership responsibilities that they will follow the new law.
Larry, just quickly. One, I'd like to underscore the point that Eric just made with respect to change. The military prides itself on implementing change and doing it very effectively. The reality is that when Admiral Chuck Larson was the superintendent at the Naval Academy in the 70s, he implemented change. He was there for the first entering class of women at the Naval Academy. That was done very successfully. The point that Eric made with respect to 1948 when President Truman issued his executive order, the reality is that change was still taking place in the early 1950s when we were engaged in the Korean War. So I believe that the military can implement this change now and do it well. And the other point I would make is, in the reality of these 2 wars today, we need more qualified service members, not less. We should not be turning away service members because of their sexual orientation. We need those service members, and we need them now.
There's actually research that suggests that wartime is the best time to do this because it's during peacetime when there isn't a focus on a acute mission that this all comes to a head and that people have more downtime to sit around worrying about who's gay. And in fact, the discharge figures go down during wartime, reflecting that no one cares, that fewer people care. So there's always going to be some reason not to do the things that people who don't want things done don't want to do. It's a great sentence, isn't it? But let me add one clearer sentence, if I can, which is we're not really even talking about social change. In 1948, the military was far out front of society. What we're talking about now is there are already gay people in the military. They're even serving openly. 2/3 of straight service members say they know or suspect gays in their units. So all we're talking about is having a policy and rhetoric that catches up to reality. It's not like we're doing some complicated thing like fixing the healthcare problem or figuring out the way forward in Afghanistan that we have to wonder how to do. People are saying, well, how would we implement this? We need a commission. What about the showers? All you have to do is stop kicking out gay people. I mean, being a little tongue-in-cheek because there are important implementation issues I don't want to be dismissive of, but it's really pretty simple.
Okay, let me do the final thing before we open it up to questions in order to be fair and balanced here. And what about the fact that many parents of youngsters who might be attracted to join the service because, as I think you mentioned, the parts of the country they come from would discourage the youngsters who ordinarily would join from joining if you have openly gay people serving?
Larry, that's pure hogwash. You talk about parents
It's
sitting.
tough to be arguing.
You talk about parents sitting down and having a serious conversation with their kids about going into the military. I don't think they have a lot of discussion that's centered around, well, you know, they're gays and lesbians in the military. But the reality is, if they were going to have that same conversation, when little Johnny and little Mary go off to the state university, well, guess what? They're gay and lesbians, you know, at Ohio State or at Penn State. So this argument just doesn't hold water anywhere. And the reality is that, as I think Nathaniel said it earlier, little Mary and little Johnny are not that fragile. I think they've already had this conversation for many years with their friends and probably earlier with their family.
Okay. Eric?
Larry, I'd like to elaborate what Aubrey said. You know, regardless, even if a parent was to discourage a young daughter or son, patriotic, individual from joining the military, this came up last July 24th at one of our first hearings with Congressman Susan Davis, and of course with Elaine Donnelly and Sergeant Major Jones there. And one of his arguments was that Sergeant Major Jones had stated that you were going to, I'm optimistic when the law does pass to get rid of no ISIL hotel, you're going to have all these young officers resigning their commissions. You're going to have no one wanting to join the military. And after a response to that afterwards, I responded to one of the reporters, well, then, going back to that young man or woman who the parent discourages, well, then good luck on finding a job anywhere. Because in this day and age in corporate America, as we know, from AT&T to Hilton to wherever you work, your supervisor, your cubicle mate is probably gay or going to be gay or someone who may be of a minority, diverse background, regardless of their orientation, gender identity, anything. So unless that parent discourages their young child from not joining the military, then they may just discourage them from even living in America for that fact, because unless they win, the Powerball or lottery, then, good luck on surviving in this day and age, and especially with healthcare and other things, because you are most likely going to have to, realize it, regardless of our beliefs or values, but the country is moving forward on change and accepting people for who they are. And so whether they join the military or not, wherever they work, they're going to work with people of my nature. So.
Okay. Do you want to add anything, Nathaniel?
Yeah, let me just play devil's advocate briefly. I mean, this is exactly right, and this is what I think too. What people say, and you'll see this in the messaging of social conservatives who have dragged out all kinds of scare tactics, is yes, but the military is forced intimacy 24/7 and things like that, and there's showers and all of that, as if they're not, again, there already. So this is more about pretending and denying what's true. But the bottom line is that the research just doesn't show that this is a problem. And over 25 nations now let gays serve openly without a problem. There's certain differences between the different cultures and the different militaries. But even accounting for those differences, all the research shows that open the gay service works. This is not about what little Mary and little Johnny want, because the military is not about what individuals want. It's important to focus on the fact that research shows that even if there might be discomfort, it works. The military can absorb it.
All right. The floor is now open for questions. Are there any members of the press who have a question? Yes, over there. If you got the... Wait for the mic and identify yourself if you would, sir.
Harry Martin with the San Antonio Express News. I've got two questions. First one for Mr. Sarvis, and that is, even though you have you said there's an impressive number of votes in the House, is it still fair to say it lacks the number to be passed there? And then the other question I have for Mr. Alva is just how frustrated are you that I heard you testify last year, this thing's taking some time. How frustrated are you that Congress won't move forward on this?
Well, first, 175 co-sponsors. There are a number of members who have said to Patrick Murphy one-on-one, I'm not going to co-sponsor it, but I will vote for it. Some of those will, some of those may not. The other reality is we know that many members, or some members, never co-sponsor bills that are pending, particularly if they're in their committee. At the end of the day, I believe that we will have the votes to pass the bill. How that vote comes about is still not clear. Do we have a vote in the House on a standalone bill on H.R. 1283, and when do we have it? Will that bill be ready this year for a vote? I think Congressman Murphy has indicated that it may not be, that it may be early next year. Do we have a vote on the FY11 Defense Department budget where the repeal language is in that bill? It's not clear. That's obviously one approach. So I think when the vote comes, where it comes is not entirely clear yet. But I believe, like much of the House leadership, the votes will be there when that vote is called.
Aubrey, let me ask you, do you expect the Quadrennial Defense Review to take this subject up at all?
I'm not sure, and you may be in a better position to know. So I haven't had any clear indication on that.
Okay. Eric?
Well, welcome to D.C., Larry. I thought I was the only one from San Antonio here today. It is a little frustrating, but in this new second life that I have, I'm very optimistic on the changes that have moved forward. Even in 2007, the last time I was here, at the time sitting next to former Congressman Meehan at the time when he introduced it at because this is the third time it's been introduced into Congress now, the Military Readiness Enhancement Act. And I do go around and I travel, and I'll be back here in D.C. in a couple weeks and Boston and things like that. And you always do get the individuals who are so frustrated and wondering, why haven't we, especially when the president, came into office and people right away said, well, in the first year the policy should fall or that it'll change. Well, I mean, as you heard Aubrey say, and I always try to, as well as when I was educated, we have no co-sponsorship in the Senate yet. This is a job that it's going to take Congress to fix. It was Congress who dealt us this blow back in 1993. So it's the current Congress, of course, who's going to deal with this. But it does take time. And I was just talking to Aubrey before we sat down and everything that, we are moving forward. We have to remain optimistic because, as I said in my remarks, we aren't going backwards. And I literally do my own take, especially to my own House representatives in San Antonio, which I think they tend to lock the door when they see me coming already. As you know, in Texas, my own two senators, which I've met hand in hand, I as someone, I think, and I try not to sound so narcissistic, but I stand in front of people who oppose, allowing gay men and women to work, and I ask them simply, why? Why not? And to just see their facial expressions and not even give me, maybe it's because I've lost my leg in Iraq or something, to not give me a definite answer is amazing. And that's what I educate the college kids of today and other people to find out who your elected representatives are and pressure them and ask them why. And even when you have them face to face, it's amazing how they can't really give you a solid answer. Because in nature, I mean, this is about life. This is about letting people do a job that they want. This is not the old days, the Cold War, and people still being oppressed. Like I said, I'm going to continue to serve my country in a capacity that when I took an oath to defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So I tell those who oppose us, watch out, because here I come. So.
Okay. All right. The floor is now open for questions. Please identify yourself. Yes, sir. And wait for the mic.
Ken Joseph with CQ Press. Can those of you who are in a position to comment on the executive order approach?
All right. Well, let me, since I've already written about this, and my feeling is that if the president would sign an executive order under stop-loss authority, basically saying we're at war, I'm not letting anybody be discharged on the basis of this. This would galvanize the debate in the country and in the Congress, and it would also deal with the question of military readiness that we've been talking about here. I mean, you're about to throw out an Air Force pilot with 18 years of service and 3,000 hours that we, the taxpayers, have invested $30-40 million in and he didn't do anything wrong. Somebody who was upset at him turned them in for no good reason. So I think that would galvanize the debate. It would get people off the dime, and something happened. Now I know others on the panel disagree with me, so I'll let them.
Well, I don't disagree with Larry, and Larry and I were having this conversation just before we sat down. If I thought that the president could issue the executive order and at the same time send a bill up to Congress calling for repeal for a legislative solution, I would be supportive of that. I think one of the realities is that we have to face the following. On at least 2 occasions, the White House has said the president is not going to issue an executive order on our stop loss. On more than 1 occasion, the White House Counsel Office has identified, from their perspective, legal concerns about the stop loss. But if the president can issue that order, and in fact it does what Larry hopes, and what I would hope, is that it's a catalyst for the president to move and for the Congress to move, fine. But consider the following. I said earlier that I accept that the president and his senior team are having ongoing discussions with Admiral Mullen and Secretary Gates on repeal. It seems to me, as I said to Larry earlier today, that if you indeed are having those discussions and you stick your finger in the eyes of Admiral Mullen and Secretary Gates with an executive order, I'm not sure how far that gets you. And consider the following. At the end of the day, Admiral Mullen and Secretary Gates do get their say, and they go before the House and the Senate Armed Services Committee to testify. But if the president can do both, I say, yes, let's do both today.
Dan, it's your group that started this.
Right. I co-authored a report through the Palm Center in May outlining this executive order option, so you can all see that on the website of the Palm Center. I primarily agree. I think that one of the benefits of an executive order is that the commander-in-chief can do it with a stroke of a pen and then overnight begin presenting the best evidence possible that openly gay service doesn't undermine the military, saying, look, we have openly gay service. Are there any problems? And there may be a few problems. There may be social disruptions. But from all the research, it's profoundly unlikely that there will be any overall disruption to the force. So then 3 months down the line, 6 months down the line, he could go to Congress, with Congress having continued to work to get enough co-sponsors to make this happen. But I think it's also important to remember that the president is the superior to Admiral Mullen. And in the early 90s, first candidate Clinton and then President Clinton had promised to issue an executive order. He was cowed by the military in part because of his own relationship to the military and an effort to please all sides, and he decided not to issue an executive order, and look at where we are now. Truman did issue an executive order. It took many years for racial integration to work out well, but he showed the military who was in charge, and so the idea of worrying about what Mullen and Gates would say once their commander-in-chief has already said, look, I've looked at the research. I've looked at the mounds of research the military itself has done, and the RAND Corporation and PERSEREC and the Palm Center, hopefully. This works. Let's do it. We need to use the Powell Doctrine, overwhelming force, and the president, it's meant as an ironic joke, but true. The president needs to get his ducks in a row by lining people up in the military community and saying, look, as Mullen has acknowledged, this is going to happen. This is what we're going to do. Let's do it right.
Okay. All right. Let's get anybody over here. I want to make sure I don't miss. Go. Okay.
Leo Shane with Stars and Stripes. Aubrey, you mentioned the House side. On the Senate side, can you handicap for us what kind of support you feel there is there and how you see the debate in the hearing coming up? Since we already saw on the House side some of the issues that came up last year, what do you think are going to be the sticking points for the senators?
I think it depends on how the chairman and the ranking minority member frame the hearing. I believe they want to hear from Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen. This will be the first time those two individuals have testified on this issue in 16 years. What Admiral Mullen says, what Secretary Gates recommends, will be enormously important to several members of both committees in the House and the Senate. Historically, traditionally, members of the Armed Services Committee have given great weight to what the Secretary and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs recommend with respect to military personnel matters. And those members, most of those members, view Don't Ask, Don't Tell as a military personnel matter. We have talked to a number of senators who have made it clear that we should be doing everything we can to obtain the support of Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen for repeal. At a minimum, we already know, and Admiral Mullen has said it, he said it at his first confirmation hearing. With respect to Don't Ask, Don't Tell, he said to Senator Collins, who was chairing his hearing, that is your law. Congress made that law. We will implement whatever you decide. I think where we are today at the White House and other places, we are trying to get Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen to say more than that. Congress already knows they will implement whatever change or decision is made. But will they go beyond that? It's not clear. And that's why I said earlier, what will be the focus of the hearing? Perhaps the focus of the hearing will be there is legislation pending to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Mr. Secretary, Chairman Mullen, let's talk about implementation. Let's have a discussion about implementation. So I think it depends in large part how it's framed. And I think it depends on what is the coalition that introduces the legislation. And as I said earlier, I think bipartisan support is desirable, is preferable.
What about Gates' statement that he wants a more humane way of handling these things? Is there any follow-up on that?
Larry, I referred to that in my earlier remarks. We sent a letter July 6th, and I believe around the same time the Palm Center did as well. Using his comments as a hook, we outlined 6 specific steps that he could take today under his existing authority to allow gays and lesbians to continue serving successfully. We have not had a response. I did get a response a day or two after that letter acknowledging receipt of it. But in terms of any substance or
post office?
Good question. No, actually, it was from the General Counsel for the Secretary of Defense. But again, it's been some time, and I think that our service members are entitled to a response.
Okay, good. Yes?
My name's Mark Krasnow. To tie the two great gay civil rights struggles together, I'd like to know your thoughts, which are gay marriage and gay men and women serving openly and proudly in the military, the repeal. I believe that until the military ban is repealed, or once the military ban is repealed, it'll be very difficult to deny gay marriage to gay men and women who serve openly and proudly and are dying for our country. But I think the ban needs to be repealed first before gay marriage will be in all 50 states. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it will be a while before it's very difficult to deny gays the right to get married. In every country, the military ban has been lifted before marriage. Of course, we have marriage equality in 5 or 6 states now, 6, and Maine's may be repealed, but not at a federal level. So I think you're right. But I wouldn't be so sure that it's a slippery slope, or at least a quick one. I think you're right to tie them together in some sense, in that the concept of equality can be so deceptively simple. You know, people are asking for equal rights, no more, no less, and that includes access to these great institutions of American life, the military and to marriage. But the opinion polls show overwhelming support for lifting the federal exclusion of military personnel who are gay or lesbian, but we're not there yet on marriage.
Anybody over here? Okay, yes. Ma'am.
Hi, I'm Lori Manning. I run the Women in the Military project at the Women's Education Research and Education Center. And I have a question. There are a lot of differences and a lot of similarities between women and gays serving in the military. After, well, over 100 years, there are still a need for groups like mine working to further the cause of military women. And I was wondering from all of you how you see when the great day comes and the ban is repealed, what do you see changing in the mission of the Palm Center, SLDN? Do you think you'll just fold and go away, or what would your job become then? And also for individual advocates like you, Eric. Thank you.
Eric, you want to start first? You can get on with your life then. And
You know, I've going back and saying that, I experienced, before Don't Ask, Don't Tell and going and speaking of change, it was interesting because, of course, at that time, a lot of people were like, oh, my God, they're going to allow, and people would say the most derogatory things, fags in the military, blah, blah, blah. And that probably lasted for about a year. And then before you know it, everybody knew that there were gays in the military. Same thing with about, women. Yeah. Well, in 1995, when I was with 3rd Marine Division, when Combat Engineer Battalion, I remember when the bus pulled up because everybody had heard rumors. Guess what? The Marine Corps has its first female combat engineer, and it was at Camp Schwab, Okinawa, which is mainly 98% men because it's all infantry, and that's where I mostly served. And I remember that day when she stepped off the bus, everybody was just like, how do we treat her? Change was happening. And, as we do these changes, and then, of course, say 3 or 4 months later, then she was just, like one of the team. Everybody was at the enlisted club having a beer with her. She did her job even better than men sometimes. So I think once we have these changes, and then, it's just, people, I think what we can do is just go and improve society as it goes along. Because we don't live in a perfect world, and every now and again you're going to get that one pessimist or person who's going to be that bad apple, who's going to say, well, I'm not going to, confide to this or whatever. So I think we will always be around as educators, as moderators, as, visible people with big hearts to help those people who still have this personal view or bias to make or help them change in some way. Because I think no matter what, it's just something that's, we don't live in a perfect world. You're always going to have someone who's just going to be that, person who just wants to be out there and not agree or say, well, this is, the way I see it, or this is my life. Well, your life is no better than anyone else's. Well, let me help you, educate you, or let me kick you with my prosthesis. I won't feel it. So, but I'm just kidding. But no, I think we'll always be around. There will be a need for all of us, no matter what happens.
All right, you can always be around.
Quickly. If Congress enacted H.R. 1283 today and the President signed it tomorrow, the first order of business would be oversight. How is the new law being enacted? And I think we would need a number of years in experience to see how implementation is truly going. Not unlike when the major civil rights initiatives passed in the 60s, the Civil Rights Division over at the Justice Department, still there, still doing oversight on enforcement. So I think that will be our initial role, is ensuring that the legislation, that the spirit and the letter of the law is being followed.
Well, Laurie, I think you said it very well. There are important similarities and differences. And the focus on sexuality in the military stands on the shoulders of the movement to make women in the military visible, at a policy level and a cultural level as well as just a physical level. And women are disproportionately affected by Don't Ask, Don't Tell, given the numbers and given the concept of lesbian baiting, where men whose advances are rebuffed often spread rumors or tell, whether it's true or not, superiors that women are lesbian. So I would echo what Aubrey says. There will be important oversight focusing on sexuality in the military and gender in the military that will be ongoing.
Yeah, I've got good news and bad news. Let me do the bad news first. I think what you will see, if we can go back and look at the changes, whether it was integration of African Americans, opening up positions to women, you're going to see people drag their feet. Even after Don't Ask, Don't Tell, it said if you don't tell, you can't be prosecuted. You had a whole bunch of people going out looking for them and violating and not getting punished. So I think it's important for these groups to stay around because there will be resistance. You mean you're a Navy captain, you know what I'm talking about. The Navy really doesn't integrate African Americans until the 70s. I mean, when I was on active duty, African Americans were, treated literally like second-class citizens. They didn't have the opportunities. And when Admiral Zumwalt finally did it in the 70s, he faced resistance. They had a revolt of the admirals, against us. So even if we pass it, it's not going to, be. The good news is, the great irony with the military is that they'll fight like heck against any change. But then once it's done, they will embrace it. Look what happened when the Center for Military Readiness went to Duncan Hunter and said the Army is using women inappropriately in Iraq. They're violating their own standards. And they actually put it in the bill to restrict them. The Army came back and said, what, are you crazy? We're going to lose the war. You can't do that. So I think that will happen. I think after this is done, and I'm hopeful it gets done sooner rather than later, people will say, we got a better military. And then somebody might come along, say, let's change it. And they'll say, no way. I mean, you see what I mean? So that's what I think will be the good news because, as it was mentioned before, they will, a lot of them will follow orders, and then they'll find out that it really helps. And then they'll say, this is great. Yes, ma'am, back there. I'm trying to go through all of the groups here.
Hi, my name's Barbara. I have a question. If the repeal happened today, as you stated, and it's easy and we just allow them in, how do you move on to the second and third effects of benefits? So it was talked about the Marriage Act, and there's only 6 states that recognize marriage. In the military, if we allowed them in today, it may be that they are looked as single soldiers and only allowed to live in the barracks. They're not allowed to move off post. Other benefits if you should get killed in combat, do they recognize your partner as the sole beneficiary, et cetera? Have we brought this to attention on how the military can work through these issues when the repeal moves forward?
Well, as you may know, H.R. 1283 does not address many of the issues that you raised. And I think the thinking was and still is that those issues should be addressed in legislation on another track, because many of those issues would involve other committees as well. But I think it's clear, and Admiral Mullen has indicated this on 2 occasions, that they are thinking of those issues and thinking them through. And he indicated that they may have a recommendation at some point. But I think the first order of business is passing H.R. 1283. Let's get this done first.
Okay. Over there. Yes, sir.
I'm Victor Stone, and my question is, I was trying to understand why at least those in favor of the bill would even want the Secretary or the Admiral to be testifying on the Hill. As a purely rational matter, if their superior, the Commander-in-Chief, says that's the policy he wants, and then as a technical matter they say, we can do it or whatever Congress wants, which means we can live with it or live without it. And we know there are no studies about how it's operating because it hasn't operated. Wouldn't that end it? And aren't you just doing what lawyers are always afraid to do, which is ask somebody a question they don't know the answer to because you may get an answer you don't like? And I guess the only thing that occurs to me is, and you can tell me if you think this is the reason that it needs to be done, is that there are congressmen from districts where the president doesn't have a lot of support, and Secretary Gates, having come from the last administration and the other party, would give cover to those congressmen who could then say, okay, I'm doing this because someone in my party said that he wants it. Otherwise, I don't quite understand why you want to risk that they'll tell you their personal preferences. They just don't like it, and then you're sunk.
Well, Nathaniel conveniently handed this one off to me. Let me say the following. When I thought I made it clear that in terms of witnesses that Chairman Levin was looking at calling, we, the advocates for repeal, don't get, unfortunately, to make up the witness list. And so you have two committee chairmen saying, I want to hear from Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen. And indeed, on the floor of the House, when Chairman Skelton, chair of the House Armed Services Committee, committed to a hearing in a colloquy with Patrick Murphy, a condition for that commitment to the hearing, he said, I want to hear from Secretary Gates. I want to hear from Admiral Mullen. If he or she is nominated, I want to hear from their new secretary for manpower and readiness. So it's not the advocates for repeal who are suggesting that Admiral Mullen and Secretary Gates be called. It's the committee chairman.
Let me add a few thoughts, if I could. I think Aubrey's right. I mean, it will be very difficult to keep them out of the debate, and they shouldn't be kept out of the debate. One of the reasons is what you suggested, political cover to some in districts who need their moral weight, as well as interest groups on the other side, or all sides, as well as not even interest groups, but interested parties who want to know what they think. I think that's appropriate. I do hope the Commander-in-Chief will, as I said, get his ducks in a row first, because this is the problem we had in 1993 when there was a public and private fight between the President and his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell. And the President was scared to say, as Truman did, if you resist this, I'll see your resignation in the morning. So it's one reason why I think an executive order, which made it a fait accompli, there'd be some blowback, but not necessarily more blowback than what the congressional fight will yield. And it would be harder for anyone to turn this around once it's already done. And because we're confident that the research shows it can be done effectively, that should be done. And there are studies about what's going on now. Technically, you're correct. There's no studies on how the new policy works because there is no official new policy of open gay service. But there's an enormous amount of research about what happens not only in foreign militaries, but in our own military. Let me say one last thing about the previous question. There's a strategy that people who opposed this used, which is called the thorny questions strategy, where Sam Nunn and others threw a rally of, I think, 30 questions about what would we do about these policies, about recognition, about dancing in the officer balls and so forth. Right now, and benefit recognition, Defensive Marriage Act, for better or for worse, you know what I think, regulates a lot of this and says the federal government will not recognize a marriage or anything that looks like a marriage. So that's good news and bad news. It simplifies the first step of repealing the policy, the statute, because it can ensure people that we're not going to have all this other stuff. Then if the other stuff seems warranted, that's a separate battle.
Well, the reality is if you addressed all those issues now, you would have to engage repeal with the debate of a repeal of DOMA. And I think strategically it's best to focus now and keep this separate on repeal only in this vehicle, which we hope will be moving in this Congress.
Eric, let me ask you to get involved in this because this is a profound question. The people who want to hear from Gates, you said when you look these people in the eye and you ask them why and why not, I mean, what did your two senators from Texas, both of whom seem to be opposed to this, what did they say? I mean, what was their...
Well, it's always interesting to see them do the two-step dance.
The Texas two-step dance.
Texas two-step dance. Of course, they always start off by saying thank you for your service. And, but it's interesting because they will do the two-step dance, and always as a politician, and most people think I want to get in politics, and I don't. It's always my constituents or my voices in my area feel that this is not the best topic at the time, or it's such things as that, their strategy, and so because I don't know, I just it's.
Did they give you any indication that if Gates or Mullen were to be in favor, they would change?
No, they actually do rely on people do rely heavily on the current status of Admiral Mullen and the Joint Chief of Staff and, current commanding generals like the Commandant, the Chief of Naval Operations. I mean, everybody relies heavily on the leadership of the military. And so they do give me that, and they wait for the outcome of what, unless you've been in the military and then they don't know really the experiences of what they can anticipate what the change will be like.
Okay.
So.
Yes, sir.
My name is Mike Turner. I'm a retired Air Force colonel. I happen to be the operations officer of an F-111 squadron in New Mexico at the time the first female fighter pilot was moving through the pipeline. I have a vivid memory of a discussion we had with our wing commander one day, and he said, okay, the first female fighter pilot is going to hit this base and go into an F-111 squadron. Who wants her? And I was an ops officer sitting in for my squadron commander, and the rule was you can send anybody to these meetings you want, but you speak for the boss, so you better be ready to step up. So they went to the first 4 squadron commanders, and all 4 of them in a row said, I don't want her. And I raised my hand and said, we'll take her, happy to have her. And when I got back to the squadron, you would have thought I shot the Pope in Vatican Square at midday. Let me just add a perspective that I've had on this. If you start with the fundamental premise that don't ask, don't tell is profoundly unconstitutional and has been since day one, you can sort of begin to arrive at some common ground, which I believe, frankly, most senior military commanders believe. The military leadership is not going to voluntarily step up and say, okay, let's get rid of don't ask, don't tell. They're going to take their orders from the civilian leadership. That's their job. And if the civilian leadership stands up and says, do it, this is not a discussion anymore. This is an order. Do it. They will salute smartly, and they will do it. There is no way Secretary Gates or the chairman are going to stand up in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee and express an opinion on don't ask, don't tell, unless the president says, let me tell you your opinion on don't ask, don't tell. That's the only way it's ever going to happen. And I think, personally, right now you have this massive battle going on in the White House between the hacks and the wonks. The wonks understand that this is a profoundly unconstitutional policy. And the hacks are saying, we kind of got a lot on our plate right now. Do we really want to bite off this bite of the apple in the Senate and the House and toss it over that way? And I think, frankly, it's just going to finally come down to the president, frankly, just having the guts to stand up and tell Admiral Mullen and Secretary Gates the next time they ask you, yes, you will go testify, and this is what you will say, and we'll let Congress battle it. But this is a pure political, tactical discussion right now. I do not believe any senior military commander that is worth their stars really believes that this policy should continue one more day. I just don't believe it.
Okay, any comment, Mike?
No, the only thing I would add is I think the point that you're underscoring is right on. The example you gave of the new pilot coming, it's about leadership. You volunteered to do it. And in this equation that we've been talking about, the civilian policymaker appointed by the president is Secretary Gates. We know that. When we talk to Admiral Mullen's staff, and some of you here today know this and you've heard it, his staff says, we have not been tasked to do anything. Who would task them in the equation? It would be Secretary Gates or it would be the president. So, as I said earlier, waiting for Secretary Gates.
Yeah, let me make a point here because you raise a profound issue. Secretary Gates is appointed by the president. He's got to do what the president says. He's got to quit. Admiral Mullen has a responsibility. He's confirmed by the Congress, and he's supposed to be honest, to the Congress. So you can't force it. He can say, I don't agree with it, but obviously I will either resign or follow it. So I think you have to get to that. And in my view, the key guy is Gates. And, why Obama kept him or didn't keep, and obviously if he comes around, it's golden because then he gives you the political cover. But basically he serves for the president. Now, we've already seen him flip on missile defense, so maybe, there's hope, he will do that. So, but I think, he really he's got to be the key here. And you can't force Mullen. He'll implement it, but you can't force him to give an opinion he doesn't agree with.
And the only quick caveat I would add is that last time this happened, we had the Secretary of Defense initially on the side of lifting the ban, and it was Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who revolted who led a revolt. And so technically you're absolutely right, and I agree with all the things you've said, with the caveat that the military, it's a hot potato party, and the politicians are saying we're waiting for the military, and so that counts.
When that happened, and I was on the speaking circuit with him, and I know what was said in those meetings, and I won't characterize what he said because that's kind of the rule of executive assistants. You never speak for your principal, but I will tell you that the general consensus was morale issues, all the old rubrics that we heard piled on. But frankly, that revolt succeeded because they knew they could get away with it. If it was made absolutely painfully clear, you can revolt, and I will pull out the big dogs, and you'll be out of a job, the revolt would end. It would end instantaneously.
That's an important point. In 1948, after President Truman allowed key military personnel to go up to the Hill and testify against his proposed order to end segregation in the ranks, he then, shortly thereafter, called them all back to the White House and said, "Gentlemen," and it was all gentlemen then, "now it's about leadership. Now we are going to do it together." And it was implicit, if you go to the Truman Library and read those documents, that if you didn't want to do it with the president, you were not going to be on the team.
Right. Sir, you've been waiting patiently over there.
My name is Eddie Eiches, and I think that the policy has a lot of collateral damage, specifically that it prevents diversity within the military. The question was raised about parents. Well, what about parents who can't deal with the fact that there is the policy, and it bothers them? My daughter received a $200,000 scholarship from the Army, ROTC scholarship, and she decided to go to Columbia. During the first week of difficult training, she said the extent of the homophobic comments were just absolutely incredible. Then what makes ROTC at Columbia so difficult, even though President Obama said that he supported returning it to the campus on September 11th, 2008, is that you have to go over to Fordham. If you're at Dartmouth, you've got to go 55 miles north, and at Harvard, you've got to go over to MIT, and it's extremely difficult. My daughter actually has now dropped out of ROTC, and I have to come up with $50,000 more per year that I was not planning to spend. But at least the allegation is as to those, I've talked to Bollinger at Columbia, and I've talked to the president at Harvard, that the alleged reason for ROTC not returning, which would, and in this economy, $200,000 does make a difference. The alleged reason is this don't ask, don't tell. So we don't have ideological and arguably intellectual diversity, that is smart people as well as dumb people in the military, because we still have this policy.
All right, let me tell you, we're getting close to out of time. What I'd like to do is everybody who has a question, including that one, just say it, then I'll give the panel a chance to sum up and make whatever final comments. We'll start over here, sir.
Do we know the position of the newly nominated Secretary of the Army, the Republican congressman? I forget his name.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Wondering what you have heard or expect to hear from military chaplains or other Christian leaders in the nation.
Okay. Any other questions here? Any? Oh, there you go. I'm sorry.
I have a comment. My name's David Adelstone, and I had the honor to represent the late Technical Sergeant Leonard Matlovich from 1974 through 1980. And I want to get back to nitty-gritty just to touch on a few things that Mr. Frank was talking about. The whole issue of showers came up. And one of my expert witnesses was Wardell Pomeroy, who was the chief investigator for the Kinsey report and what CBS called the fumbling cross-examination by the recorder, the prosecutor in an administrative proceeding. Asked him about what happens if people are stationed in the Antarctic for a year, all men down there, they're taking showers together. And Dr. Pomeroy said, "I'm glad you asked that. I have an admiral client in therapy, and he was just in such a situation. Well-adjusted people do not go around grabbing other people." And not letting it go at that, he proceeded to still ask questions, and Pomeroy interjected, "In most cases, gay and lesbian people are not interested in having sex with straight people." And finally, at that point, the colonel gave up, and the rest is history.
Is that why you won the case?
No, we won the case because the Air Force stubbornly claimed that they could have an exception, a regulation with an exception in it, but they could never explain why he wasn't the exception. And we had Judge Gerhard Gazelle, who drove a Mack truck into their exception.
Okay, good. Any final questions or comments over there? All right, Eric, why don't we start with you, and we'll go back down the thing. Any final comments or response to the question?
Well, I knew that the new Secretary of the Army, McHugh, I believe that's his name,
Yeah.
McHugh, was actually at the House Armed Services Committee last year, Subcommittee of Military Personnel, all that. Actually, at the start of the hearing, of course, he was on the devil advocate side. And by the end of the hearing, it was almost that he was in favor of repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and by the end of the hearing, if it's on YouTube, you can hear it even in other people's voices from the opposing side that it was an issue that they were willing to take up. And I don't know his view now since he's been appointed. Maybe Aubrey can answer as Army Secretary, but if you look at the video, you can see it, how it's something that he is willing to entertain and discuss.
Just 30 seconds on that. At his confirmation hearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator McCaskill asked him, Mr. McHugh, his views on Don't Ask, Don't Tell. He basically indicated that he was in line with the president on repeal. When she asked him if he had had a direct conversation with the president about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, he said no. And this was in contradiction to earlier questions that Mr. Gibbs had received at the White House when the nomination went up to the Hill, that the president and Mr. McHugh had discussed repeal. But in his response to the senator, he said they had not. But he did indicate that he was aligned with the president on repeal, and he knew what the president's position was.
Did you want to address military chaplains? You might know more than I.
Military chaplains or ROTC?
Quickly, there are conversations going on, I think, I know, in an effort, I think, to avoid what we saw with some of the military chaplains testifying in opposition to open service 16 years ago. So I believe the hope is to mitigate some of that opposition. No doubt some of it is still there, but I think a lot of thought is going into how we might minimize that and working at the highest levels to do so.
And I'm delighted to be able to end with the showers, because I do think, in seriousness, that this will be, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, because it's so easy to cast aside, in a way, the currency of the upcoming debate when and if there's movement on this issue. What I always say to people, and I said this when I addressed cadets at West Point, is, you know, don't you, that there are already gays in the showers with you, right? And they sort of grumble that they do, and I say, so tell me, how does a policy that invites you to pretend that what you know is true isn't true, how does that help protect your privacy or your morale? And I say, I would think you'd want to know who's gay so you could watch your back and move on. So I try to make a little light of it, but honestly, this is about whether we're going to have a reality-based policy. It's not really very much of a change in policy. It's about making sure that people like Eric don't end up discharged for something that has nothing to do with his capacity to be an American hero. So I also want to thank the American Constitution Society, because I think I may have forgotten to do that at the beginning, but this was a terrific panel.
Likewise.
Okay, let me thank the American Constitution Society for putting this on and to elucidate all of these issues. By nature, I'm an optimistic person, and you go back and you look at what happened with the integration of African Americans, as I mentioned. The Navy doesn't do it till the 1970s, so even when you do it, these things do take a while. The other is we kind of slid over it, but the Congress can take the lead. It was the Congress over the opposition of the Department of Defense and the military that opened up combat positions to women after the first Persian Gulf War, showed that a lot of the things that people had said about women certainly were not true. And then the final thing is, we've talked about the 13,000 people who've been discharged, but there's pretty good evidence that another 4,000 to 5,000 people leave every year because they don't like the policy. So if you put that all in there, you're talking about 100,000 people who could be in the service who are not, and that does undermine the military readiness. So thank you all very much. Thank you for the Constitution Society. Please join me in thanking the panelists.